Abandoned duckling joins lonely man. Their friendship changes both their lives. How will story unfold? To find out, watch the video to the end. But first, please subscribe to my channel and turn on notifications to get more stories like this. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting a golden hue over the quiet park. The air was crisp with the scent of damp grass, and the occasional rustling of leaves filled the space with a calming melody. On a worn-out wooden bench, nestled under the towering oak tree, sat a man who had long forgotten what it meant to smile. His name was Henry Thompson, a retired professor who had once spent his days lecturing eager students, but now found himself drowning in solitude. His wife, Eleanor, had passed away 3 years ago, and with her, so had his joy. His days were spent in silent mourning, his only companions being the books that no longer seemed to hold any meaning. Henry exhaled deeply, watching the mist escape from his lips in the cool evening air. His hands trembled slightly as he reached into his coat pocket, pulling out a crumpled photograph. It was a picture of him and Eleanor on their wedding day, frozen in time, their smiles radiating pure happiness. He traced her face with his thumb, feeling the emptiness grow in his chest. The park was nearly empty, save for the distant laughter of children playing and the faint murmur of conversations from passing couples. Henry was used to being invisible in a world that had moved on without him. He preferred it that way until today. A faint rustling sound broke through his melancholic thoughts. At first, he ignored it, assuming it was just the wind playing tricks with the dry autumn leaves. But then, he felt something peculiar, a soft, feathery touch against his hand. He looked down, startled, and his weary eyes met the tiniest, most fragile creature he had ever seen. A duckling. It was impossibly small, its body barely larger than Henry's palm. Its downy feathers were a mix of soft brown and white, and its tiny beak twitched as it let out a hesitant chirp. The little creature wobbled on his lap, its beady black eyes staring up at him with a mixture of curiosity and trust. Henry blinked, as if unsure whether this was a figment of his imagination. "What are you doing here, little one?" His voice was hoarse from disuse, but the duckling didn't flinch. Instead, it nestled into his palm as if it had found the safest place in the world. A lump formed in Henry's throat. He hadn't been needed in a long time. Not by anyone, not by anything. Yet, here was this tiny, helpless creature seeking warmth and protection. His fingers curled slightly, cradling the duckling as a wave of unfamiliar warmth spread through his chest. "Where's your mother?" he whispered, glancing around the park. There were no other ducks in sight, no sign of a family nearby. Just this one small orphan soul who had chosen him, of all people, to trust. The duckling chirped again, and Henry felt an unexplainable tug in his heart. He had spent years mourning, pushing away the world, convincing himself that he was meant to be alone. But this little creature had appeared out of nowhere, breaking through the walls he had so carefully built. Gently, he cupped the duckling in his hands and brought it closer to his chest. "Well, I suppose we're both alone now, aren't we?" The duckling wiggled in response, nestling deeper into his warmth. Henry let out a breathy chuckle, one that felt foreign yet strangely familiar. For the first time in years, he didn't feel invisible. The night grew colder, and Henry realized he couldn't just leave the duckling in the park. He hesitated for only a moment before tucking it gently inside his coat, feeling its warmth against his chest. With slow, careful steps, he made his way back to his small apartment, unsure of what he was doing but certain that he couldn't just walk away. As he entered his dimly lit home, he felt an odd sense of purpose. He placed the duckling on the old armchair beside the fireplace and went to the kitchen, rummaging through his cabinets for anything remotely suitable. After some searching, he found a small bowl and filled it with warm water, setting it carefully in front of the little bird. The duckling hesitated before taking a tentative sip, its tiny body trembling slightly. Henry watched in fascination, feeling something stir deep within him. He had spent so long believing that he had no more love to give, that he had lost his ability to care. But here he was, fussing over a fragile creature, worrying whether it was warm enough, fed enough, Safe enough. You need a name? He mused, watching as the duckling waddled toward him, its webbed feet making soft tapping sounds on the wooden floor. It stopped just before his shoe, looking up expectantly. Charlie, he decided suddenly. How does that sound? The duckling chirped in response, and Henry chuckled. A real, genuine chuckle that surprised even him. Charlie felt right. Days passed, and Henry's once lifeless home was now filled with soft quacks and the gentle sound of tiny feet pattering around. Charlie followed him everywhere, waddling after him as he moved from room to room. When Henry read his morning newspaper, Charlie nestled by his feet. When he prepared meals, Charlie would sit on the kitchen counter, watching intently as if trying to learn. And at night, when the loneliness crept back in, Henry found comfort in the soft weight of Charlie sleeping beside him, his tiny body rising and falling with each breath. For the first time since Eleanor had passed, Henry had a reason to wake up in the morning. One particularly cold afternoon, Henry bundled up in his coat, tucked Charlie into a small pouch he had sewn inside, and ventured back to the park where they first met. He sat on the same bench, watching the world move around him. This time, he wasn't just an observer, he was part of it. A young woman passing by noticed the duckling peeking out from Henry's coat and smiled. "That's adorable. Is he your pet?" Henry hesitated before answering. "More like a friend." The woman's smile grew. "Well, he seems to love you." Henry looked down at Charlie, who nuzzled against his hand. The warmth in his chest grew. "Yeah," he murmured. "I think I love him, too." For the first time in a long time, Henry felt like he belonged. He wasn't just the lonely man on the bench anymore. He was Charlie's person, and that was more than enough. Winter came earlier than expected that year, and Henry found himself worrying about Charlie more than he had anticipated. His small apartment was warm enough for him, but what about a tiny duckling who should have been in a nest by a lake? The thought of Charlie being cold or uncomfortable gnawed at him, so he did something he hadn't done in years. He went shopping. Henry bundled up and walked into a pet store, feeling slightly ridiculous as he approached the young cashier. "Excuse me, do you have anything for a duck?" The cashier, a girl no older than 20, blinked in confusion. "A duck?" "Yes." Henry cleared his throat, feeling slightly self-conscious. "A duck. He's small. A baby, really?" A slow smile spread across the girl's face. "That's adorable," she said, before leading him to the small animal section. They didn't have anything explicitly made for ducks, but she recommended a small heating pad and a soft nesting blanket that could work just fine. Henry bought them both, along with a small stuffed toy in the shape of a duck, because why not? When he returned home, Charlie greeted him with enthusiastic chirps, flapping his tiny wings as Henry set up his new nest in the corner of the living room. The heating pad kept him warm, and the blanket was softer than anything Henry had ever felt. Charlie inspected it all curiously before settling in, tucking himself into the plush nest with a satisfied little quack. Henry chuckled, sitting down beside him. "You've got it better than me now," he joked, watching as Charlie stretched his tiny legs before curling up. He hadn't realized how much he had needed this. Someone to care for, someone to look after. It wasn't just Charlie who had been saved that day in the park. Henry had been, too. Days turned into weeks, and as the snow began to fall outside, Charlie continued to grow. He was no longer the tiny, fragile duckling Henry had first held in his hands. His feathers had started to develop. His chirps had turned into more distinct quacks, and his once clumsy waddling was now more confident. Henry found himself amazed at how quickly time was passing, how quickly Charlie was changing. But with growth came the inevitable thought Henry had been pushing to the back of his mind. Charlie wouldn't be able to stay forever. He knew that, didn't he? Ducks weren't meant to live in small apartments, nestled in heating pads and blankets. They were meant to fly, to swim in lakes, to be free. But the thought of letting Charlie go made his chest ache. He had already lost so much: his wife, his purpose, his sense of belonging. Now, when he had finally found something that made life worth waking up for, was he supposed to let it go? Henry shook the thought away and focused on the present. Charlie was still here, still waddling after him, still nuzzling against his arm as they sat together in the evenings. That was enough. For now, that was enough. It wasn't until early spring that Henry realized he could no longer ignore the inevitable. Charlie had grown. His wings were strong now, and he had started flapping them more frequently, as if instinctively preparing for flight. His eyes lingered longer on the window when the birds outside chirped. Henry pretended not to notice. One morning, Henry took Charlie back to the park where they had first met. The air was fresh, the grass was a vibrant green, and the lake glistened under the sun. It was the perfect day, too perfect. Henry sat on their usual bench, watching as Charlie explored the grass, his webbed feet pressing into the damp earth. He waddled around happily, pecking at leaves and chirping at the occasional squirrel that passed by. Henry smiled, but there was a lump in his throat. Charlie was happy here. This was where he belonged. Henry sighed, rubbing his hands together as he watched his little companion play. He had read somewhere that ducks, if raised by humans, sometimes struggled to return to the wild. But Charlie had always been independent. He was fearless, curious, adventurous. If there was ever a duck who could find his way, it was Charlie. Still, the thought of saying goodbye felt unbearable. Charlie, Henry called gently. Charlie quacked, trotting over and hopping onto the bench beside him, tilting his head in that inquisitive way he always did. Henry smiled sadly. "You know you can't stay forever, right?" Charlie blinked. Henry let out a shaky breath. "You were meant to be out there, in the world, not cooped up in a small apartment with an old man." Charlie fluffed his feathers and quacked in protest, nuzzling against Henry's sleeve. Henry chuckled, despite the tightness in his chest. "You're making this harder than it already is." For the next few hours, Henry just sat there, watching Charlie play, watching the sun reflect off the water, watching the world move around him. He wanted to memorize this moment. The way the air smelled, the way the light hit the grass, the way Charlie's feathers looked against the backdrop of the lake. Because soon it would just be a memory. The day Henry let Charlie go was the hardest day of his life since losing Eleanor. He brought him to the lake one last time. This time, he didn't just sit on the bench. He knelt by the water's edge, where Charlie stood hesitantly, his little body trembling slightly. Henry swallowed hard. "You can do this," he murmured, stroking the top of Charlie's head. "I know you can," Charlie quacked, nudging his beak against Henry's hand. Henry closed his eyes for a moment, steadying himself. "Go on," he whispered. Charlie hesitated, looking at Henry one last time before stepping into the water. He flapped his wings, testing them against the air, before taking another step. Then another. Then, with one final chirp, he spread his wings fully and lifted himself off the ground, soaring toward the water. Henry watched, his heart pounding as Charlie landed gracefully on the lake, swimming in wide circles before turning back to look at him. For a moment, Henry hoped that Charlie might return. But then, Charlie flapped his wings and took off, disappearing into the distance. Henry stood there long after Charlie had vanished from sight. The wind rustled through the trees, carrying with it the distant sound of birds chirping. For the first time in years, Henry didn't feel alone. He felt full of love, of memories, of the undeniable proof that he had mattered to someone. Charlie had been his reason to wake up, and now, even though he was gone, Henry knew that he would carry that love with him always. As he turned to leave, he smiled, a real, genuine smile. Because love, he realized, doesn't disappear. It simply changes. And sometimes, if you're lucky, it finds you again when you least expect it. Henry returned home to an apartment that suddenly felt too quiet. The warmth that had once filled the small space, the sound of tiny webbed feet tapping against the floor, and the soft, comforting quacks that greeted him every morning were all gone. The nest by the corner of the living room was empty, the small heating pad untouched. The silence was deafening. He told himself he had done the right thing. Charlie needed to be free, to find his own kind, to live the life nature had intended for him. But that didn't make the ache in his chest any less painful. It was strange, really, how a creature so small had managed to fill such a vast emptiness in his heart. Henry sat down in his worn-out armchair, staring at the now lifeless corner where Charlie used to sleep. He had spent so many evenings just sitting here, watching that little duckling waddle around the room, always full of energy and curiosity. For the first time in months, Henry felt the loneliness creep back in. It was irrational. He had spent years alone, barely noticing the passage of time. But after having Charlie around, he now felt the weight of every passing hour, every minute spent in silence. The days felt longer, the nights even worse. By the third day, Henry found himself at the park again. He told himself he wasn't looking for Charlie. He knew the duck had already moved on, had probably flown miles away by now. But still, his eyes scanned the lake, hoping to catch a glimpse of familiar brown feathers. Nothing. He sat on their usual bench, watching the other ducks swim, listening to the rustling of the trees. He wasn't sure what he was expecting. Perhaps a sign, a reassurance that he had done the right thing? He sighed, rubbing his hands together as he leaned forward. He needed to accept it. Charlie was gone, and that was okay. At least that's what he kept telling himself. But just when Henry was about to get up and leave, something caught his attention. A small figure emerged from the water, paddling towards the shore with determined little strokes. Henry held his breath. Couldn't be. But as the duck swam closer, he saw it. The familiar glint in those bright little eyes, the distinct way his feathers ruffled as he shook off the water. "Charlie," Henry whispered, his voice barely audible. The duck let out a loud quack and flapped his wings excitedly, waddling as fast as his little legs could carry him toward Henry. Henry felt his chest tighten as Charlie hopped onto the bench beside him, nudging his beak against his arm, just like he always used to. "You came back," Henry murmured, his throat tight. Charlie quacked again, settling into the crook of Henry's arm as if he had never left. Henry let out a breathless chuckle, rubbing the top of Charlie's head. "You stubborn little thing." For the next hour, they just sat there, man and duck, watching the world go by. Henry knew what this meant. Charlie had chosen him. Spring turned into summer, and Charlie remained by Henry's side. He still swam in the lake, still explored the park, but every evening, without fail, he returned to the small apartment, curling up in his usual spot. Henry no longer questioned it. He had stopped worrying about what was right or natural. All that mattered was that Charlie was happy. And Henry, for the first time in a long time, he was happy too. People in the neighborhood started to recognize them. The old man with the duck. They greeted Henry with smiles, waved at Charlie as he waddled by. Some even stopped to chat, to ask about Charlie's story, to share their own. Henry, the man who had once kept to himself, who had spent years lost in his own solitude, now found himself a part of something. Community. It was strange how life worked sometimes. Charlie had been the reason Henry had opened his heart again. And in doing so, he had found more than just a friend. He had found a reason to keep going, to keep living, to keep loving. And he knew no matter what happened next, that would never change. Because love, true love, never really leaves. It simply finds new ways to stay. The sun cast golden streaks across the lake as Henry and Charlie walked their usual path through the park. The gentle rustling of leaves in the breeze mixed with the distant laughter of children playing by the swings. Henry held his usual cup of coffee, while Charlie waddled beside him, occasionally stopping to peck at the ground or greet a familiar face. "Morning, Henry," called out an elderly woman sitting on a bench, her small terrier curled up beside her. "Morning, Margaret," Henry replied with a smile, tipping his hat. "And good morning to you too, Charlie," she chuckled, tossing a few breadcrumbs toward him. Charlie quacked appreciatively and pecked at the crumbs before trotting back to Henry's side. Henry never imagined he'd be the type of man who people would recognize, much less one who had a duck as his closest companion. But here he was, strolling through the park, greeting familiar faces, and feeling a sense of belonging that had eluded him for most of his life. One afternoon, as Henry and Charlie sat by the lake, an unexpected visitor approached. A young boy, no older than 10, stood hesitantly a few feet away, his gaze locked onto Charlie. "Is he your pet?" the boy asked softly. Henry chuckled, looking down at the duck nestled beside him. Well, I suppose you could say that. Though I think Charlie likes to think he owns me. The boy grinned but didn't move closer. Henry noticed the way he shifted uncomfortably, as if unsure whether he was allowed to step forward. Would you like to pet him? Henry asked gently. The boy hesitated before nodding. He took small, careful steps forward until he was close enough to crouch down beside them. Charlie eyed him curiously before tilting his head and letting out a soft quack. The boy's face lit up. "He's so soft," he whispered as he gently ran his fingers over Charlie's feathers. Henry watched the interaction with a warm feeling in his chest. "Do you like ducks?" he asked. The boy nodded. "Yeah, but my mom says we can't have pets. She says I get too attached." Henry's smile faltered slightly at the boy's words. He understood the feeling all too well. "Charlie found me when I was feeling pretty alone," Henry admitted. "Sometimes, the right friend comes along when you least expect it." The boy looked up at him, his eyes filled with something that resembled longing. "I wish I had a friend like Charlie." Henry studied the boy for a moment before nodding toward the park bench. "You're welcome to visit him anytime you like." The boy's face broke into a wide grin. "Really? Of course," Henry said with a chuckle. "Charlie likes making new friends." From that day forward, the boy, whose name was Daniel, became a regular visitor. Every afternoon, after school, he would run straight to the park, looking for Henry and Charlie. The three of them would sit together, sharing stories, feeding the ducks, and enjoying the simple pleasures of companionship. Henry hadn't realized how much he missed conversation, missed watching someone's eyes light up in excitement as they talked. And for the first time in years, he felt as if he had a family again. As autumn settled in, the leaves turned shades of amber and gold, painting the park with breathtaking colors. The air carried a crispness that hinted at the coming winter, but Henry and Charlie still took their daily walks, enjoying every moment they had together. One morning, as they made their way to their usual bench, Henry noticed something unusual. Charlie wasn't walking beside him. He turned around, expecting to see the duck pecking at the ground or waddling behind at his usual pace. But instead, Charlie was sitting completely still, his head tucked under his wing. Concern prickled at Henry's chest. "Charlie," he called, kneeling down. The duck didn't respond. Henry gently reached out, running his fingers over Charlie's feathers. "Hey, buddy, what's wrong?" Charlie let out a weak quack but didn't move. His usual lively energy was absent, replaced by an eerie stillness that sent panic through Henry's veins. Something was wrong, very wrong. Henry's hands trembled as he gently lifted Charlie, cradling him close. The duck's body felt oddly limp, his feathers lacking the usual resistance when Henry stroked them. His heart pounded as he scanned the park, searching for anyone who might help. He spotted Daniel sitting on the bench, waving excitedly when he saw them approach. The boy's smile faltered when he noticed Henry's worried expression. "Mr. Henry, what's wrong?" Daniel asked, standing up. "It's Charlie," Henry said, his voice tight with worry. "He's not acting like himself." Daniel's eyes widened as he stepped closer, gently touching Charlie's wing. "He feels cold," he murmured. Henry nodded. "I need to get him to a vet." The problem was, Henry had no idea where to take him. He'd never needed a vet before. Charlie had always been strong, independent, seemingly invincible. But now, as the duck lay weak in his arms, Henry realized just how fragile he truly was. Daniel pulled out his phone. "I can look up a vet nearby," he said, his fingers flying across the screen. Charlie's recovery was slow but steady. Each day, Henry saw small improvements. Charlie preening his feathers more, stretching his wings, quacking softly in response when Henry spoke. It was a relief, but Henry still found himself watching him closely, afraid that one wrong move might set him back. Daniel continued his daily visits, each time bringing new surprises. One afternoon, he arrived with a small plastic kiddie pool. "I thought maybe he'd like a little swim," Daniel explained, grinning. Henry chuckled as he helped set it up in the corner of his tiny backyard. They filled it with clean water, and Henry carefully placed Charlie inside. At first, the duck simply floated, his tired body still recovering. But then, As if testing the waters, he flapped his wings and kicked his feet, sending little splashes flying everywhere. Daniel laughed. "Look at him go!" Henry watched as Charlie's movements grew stronger, more confident. "Yeah," he said, his heart swelling with relief. "He's coming back." As Charlie paddled happily, Daniel sat beside Henry on the porch. The boy had become a permanent fixture in Henry's life, and surprisingly, he didn't mind. In fact, he enjoyed the company. "You know," Daniel said, picking at the hem of his shirt, "I think Charlie was really lucky to find you." Henry smirked. "I think I was the lucky one." Daniel grinned but didn't argue. That night, as Henry tucked Charlie into his makeshift bed, he realized how much he'd come to love this little duck. Charlie wasn't just a pet, he was family. A few days later, Henry woke to the sound of urgent quacking. It was different from Charlie's usual chatter. This was frantic, almost panicked. He jumped out of bed and ran outside, finding Charlie near the edge of the fence, flapping wildly. "What's wrong, buddy?" Henry asked, kneeling beside him. Charlie quacked loudly and pecked at Henry's arm before turning back toward the fence. Henry followed his gaze and froze. On the other side of the fence, a small duckling was struggling in the grass. It looked weak, its tiny body trembling. "Oh no," Henry murmured. Without hesitation, he climbed over the fence and carefully scooped up the duckling. It barely reacted, its little eyes fluttering open before closing again. "Where did you come from?" Henry whispered. Charlie let out a soft quack and nudged the duckling with his beak. Daniel arrived moments later, out of breath. "What happened?" Henry held up the duckling. "Charlie found him. I think he's hurt." Daniel's eyes widened. "We have to help him." Henry nodded. "Let's get him inside." They rushed back into the house, setting up a warm spot for the duckling. Henry fetched some water and gently dripped a few drops onto the tiny bird's beak. Daniel watched with wide eyes. "Will he be okay?" Henry sighed. "I don't know, but we're gonna do everything we can." Charlie stayed close, watching over the duckling with an intensity Henry had never seen before. It was as if he understood exactly what was happening. And maybe, in a way, he did. Over the next several days, Henry, Daniel, and Charlie nursed the little duckling back to health. They named him Pip, and slowly but surely he began to regain his strength. One evening, as Henry sat on the porch watching Charlie and Pip waddle around the backyard, Daniel turned to him. "You saved him," Daniel said. Henry shook his head. "Charlie did. He's got a good heart." Daniel nodded. "Yeah, just like you." Henry looked at the boy beside him, then at the two ducks in the yard. His heart ached in a way he couldn't explain. For the longest time, he had been alone. But now, sitting here with Daniel and Charlie, and now Pip, he realized something. He wasn't alone anymore. And for the first time in years, that thought didn't scare him. It made him feel whole. Days turned into weeks, and life at Henry's house slowly adjusted to its new normal. Charlie, once a tiny, fragile duckling, had grown into a strong and independent bird, waddling confidently around the yard. Pip, the little duckling they had rescued, was thriving under Charlie's watchful care, following him everywhere as if he were his own personal protector. Henry found himself smiling more. It was strange to think that just months ago, he had spent his days in quiet solitude, with no one but the echoes of his past for company. Now, there was constant movement, constant noise, quacks from Charlie and Pip, the excited chatter of Daniel whenever he came over, and the rustling of leaves as the ducks explored every corner of his small backyard. One afternoon, Henry sat on the porch, watching Pip chase after a butterfly, flapping his tiny wings as if he could lift off at any moment. Charlie followed behind, keeping a close eye on him. "They're like brothers," Daniel said, grinning as he sat down beside Henry. "Charlie's always looking out for him." Henry nodded. "Yeah, it's funny. I thought I was taking care of Charlie, but he's the one who's been teaching me things." Daniel tilted his head. "Like what?" Henry hesitated. He had never been the sentimental type, but Daniel had a way of drawing things out of him. "Like how to let people in," Henry finally said, his voice quieter than usual. "How to care again." Daniel smiled. "That's a good lesson." Henry chuckled. Yeah, and a hard one. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the ducks. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the grass, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink. Daniel shifted beside him. You ever think about getting more ducks? Henry raised an eyebrow. More? Daniel shrugged. Yeah, like a whole flock. Henry snorted. I can barely keep up with these two. Daniel laughed. I think you'd be great at it. Henry shook his head, amused. The idea of having an entire yard full of ducks was ridiculous. But then again, so was the idea of ever having one in the first place. And yet, here he was. That night, as Henry locked up the house, he glanced at Charlie and Pip, who were nestled together in their little corner of the backyard. Maybe Daniel was right. Maybe there was room for more. The next morning, Henry was woken up by a loud commotion outside. He groggily got out of bed and stumbled toward the window, rubbing the sleep from his eyes. What he saw made his heart lurch. Charlie was flapping his wings wildly, his loud quacks echoing through the yard. Pip was nowhere in sight. Henry rushed outside, Daniel arriving at the same time from the other side of the fence. What's going on? Daniel asked, breathless. I don't know, Henry said, scanning the yard. Something's wrong. Then they heard it. A faint, desperate quack coming from the far end of the yard. Henry and Daniel ran toward the sound, their hearts pounding. And then they saw him. Pip had fallen into a small hole near the back fence. It was deep enough that he couldn't climb out, and he was struggling, his tiny wings flapping in distress. Charlie stood on the edge of the hole, peering down at Pip, his whole body tense. He turned to Henry, quacking loudly, as if begging for help. It's okay, buddy, Henry murmured, kneeling down. We've got him. Carefully, he reached down, his fingers curling around Pip's small body. The little duck was trembling as Henry lifted him out and held him close to his chest. You're okay, Henry soothed, stroking Pip's soft feathers. You're safe now. Charlie let out a relieved quack and immediately nudged Pip, checking him over as if making sure he was unharmed. Daniel let out a shaky breath. That was close. Henry nodded. Too close. They spent the rest of the afternoon reinforcing the yard, filling in any gaps and making sure there were no other hazards. Charlie never left Pip's side, standing protectively next to him as if vowing to never let anything happen to him again. That night, as Henry watched them settle in for bed, he realized something. Charlie and Pip weren't just ducks to him anymore. They were family, and for the first time in a long, long time, he felt like he belonged. As the days passed, Henry's attachment to Charlie and Pip deepened. What started as a simple act of kindness, saving a lone duckling, had grown into something far greater than he ever expected. The two ducks had become inseparable, and watching them together brought a warmth to Henry's heart that he hadn't felt in years. One particularly crisp morning, Henry sat on his porch, a steaming cup of coffee in hand, while Charlie and Pip waddled around the yard. The frost on the grass shimmered under the rising sun, giving everything a magical glow. Pip, now bigger but still following Charlie like a shadow, pecked curiously at the frozen ground, confused by the sudden change in texture. Daniel arrived just as Henry was finishing his coffee, a wide grin plastered across his face. You're up early, Henry said, raising an eyebrow. Had to see my favorite ducks, Daniel replied with a shrug, hopping up onto the porch railing. Plus, I had an idea, Henry sighed. Why do I get the feeling I'm not going to like this? Daniel laughed. Come on, old man. Humor me. What if we built Charlie and Pip a real pond? Henry blinked. A pond? Yeah. Daniel gestured to the yard. Right here. They love water, right? Imagine them swimming around, splashing, having the time of their lives. Henry scratched his chin, glancing over at Charlie and Pip. He had to admit the idea wasn't terrible. Charlie often played in the water bowl Henry left out for them, and Pip seemed to adore every drop of rain that pooled in the grass. A pond? Huh? Henry mused. Daniel leaned forward. We could dig it ourselves. I know a guy who could get us a liner, maybe some rocks to make it look nice. It wouldn't have to be huge, Henry chuckled. You make it sound so easy. Because it is. Daniel grinned. Come on, let's do it. With a deep breath, Henry set his coffee cup down. All right, kid, let's build a pond. The next few days were filled with hard work. Henry and Daniel dug up a section of the yard, careful to avoid disrupting Charlie and Pip's routine. The ducks watched with great curiosity, often waddling over to inspect their progress. By the third day, the hole was deep enough, and Daniel brought over a waterproof liner to shape the pond. They placed large rocks around the edges, making it look as natural as possible. Finally, they filled it with fresh water, stepping back to admire their work. Charlie was the first to test it. With an excited quack, he waddled forward and dipped his webbed feet into the water. He hesitated for only a second before taking the plunge, paddling around with pure delight. Pip, hesitant at first, eventually followed suit, splashing and chirping excitedly. Henry couldn't stop the smile from spreading across his face. They love it, Daniel said proudly. Yeah, Henry murmured. They really do. Watching them swim, Henry realized something else. This wasn't just for the ducks. It was for him too. A project that gave him purpose, something to look forward to every day. For the first time in years, his house didn't feel empty anymore. As the weeks passed, the pond became Charlie and Pip's favorite place. They spent hours swimming, dipping their heads under, chasing each other around. But one evening, something unexpected happened. Henry was outside, feeding the ducks, when he noticed Charlie acting strangely. He wasn't swimming like usual. Instead, he stood still at the edge of the pond, his head tilted slightly. Pip, sensing something was off, stayed close but didn't seem to understand what was wrong. Charlie, Henry called. The duck turned to look at him but didn't move. His body was tense, feathers slightly ruffled. Something was wrong. Henry hurried over, his heart pounding. As he got closer, he saw it. A small, dark shape floating just beneath the surface of the water. Turtle. It wasn't large, but it was enough to make Charlie wary. The little creature had somehow made its way into the pond, and Charlie was clearly not sure what to do about it. Henry chuckled. You scared of a turtle, big guy? Charlie let out a soft quack, still unsure. Daniel arrived a few minutes later and laughed when he saw what was happening. A turtle? That's what has him spooked. Looks like it, Henry said, hands on his hips. Daniel knelt down, watching as the turtle slowly paddled to the edge of the pond. Should we move it? Henry thought for a moment. Let's see what Charlie does. Charlie took a tentative step closer, lowering his head to inspect the intruder. The turtle, seemingly unfazed, blinked lazily in response. Then, in the most unexpected turn of events, Pip stepped forward, puffing up his tiny chest as if he were about to defend his big brother. Daniel burst into laughter. Oh man, Pip's about to throw down with a turtle. Henry shook his head, amused. But after a moment, something incredible happened. Charlie relaxed. He let out a soft quack, as if realizing the turtle wasn't a threat. Pip, following his lead, also backed down. The turtle lingered for a while, then slowly crawled out of the pond, making its way toward the trees. Charlie and Pip watched it go, standing side by side. Looks like they made a new friend, Henry mused. Daniel grinned. Yeah. And Charlie learned something today. Henry looked down at the ducks, warmth spreading in his chest. Yeah, he murmured. And so did I. The morning air was crisp, a gentle mist rising from the pond as Henry sipped his coffee on the porch. Charlie and Pip had become early risers, greeting each day with their usual quacks and waddles around the yard. The pond had become their sanctuary, a place where they played, bathed, and even napped under the sun. Henry watched them fondly, feeling an unfamiliar yet welcome sense of contentment. Daniel arrived just as the sun was climbing over the treetops. He had a bag of duck feed slung over his shoulder and a mischievous grin on his face. Morning, old man, he greeted, tossing the bag onto the porch. Henry raised an eyebrow. You're too chipper for this early. That's because I have news, Daniel announced, taking a seat on the porch railing. Guess what I found out yesterday? Henry leaned back in his chair, pretending to think. You finally realized you can't grow a decent beard? Daniel chuckled. Funny. No, I talked to a wildlife expert, someone who works at the conservation center nearby. Told them about Charlie and Pip. Henry's grip on his coffee mug tightened slightly. What about them? Relax, Daniel assured him. They just said it's unusual for a mallard to take in another duck like that. Charlie's kind of an anomaly. Most drakes don't stick around to raise a duckling, let alone one that isn't even theirs. Henry nodded. He had suspected as much. There was something special about Charlie, something he couldn't quite put into words. But that's not the big news, Daniel continued. The expert said that if Pip is really attached to Charlie, we might need to prepare for something. Henry frowned. Prepare for what? Daniel hesitated, then said, Pip might not fly away when he's grown. Henry blinked. What do you mean? Normally, ducks migrate, Daniel explained. But sometimes, if a duck is raised outside of a natural flock, it might stay with the one it bonded with instead of following migration patterns. If Pip sees Charlie as his whole world, he might never leave. Henry stared at the two ducks in the yard, watching as Pip followed Charlie like a shadow. Would that be a bad thing? He asked. Daniel shrugged. Not necessarily. But it does mean we'd be responsible for him long-term. Henry let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. The thought of Pip staying permanently wasn't something he had considered before. But now that the idea was in his head, he realized he didn't mind it. Guess we'll see what happens, Henry murmured. Daniel grinned. Exactly. As the weeks passed, Pip grew bigger and stronger. His baby fluff had almost completely disappeared, replaced by sleek feathers. But despite his growing independence, he never strayed far from Charlie. One afternoon, Henry sat by the pond, watching them swim. Pip had become quite the little adventurer, diving underwater and popping up with an excited quack. Charlie, always the responsible one, kept a watchful eye on him. Henry chuckled. You're a good brother, Charlie. The duck turned his head at the sound of his name, as if acknowledging the compliment. Henry never thought he'd be the kind of man to talk to ducks, but here he was. The peaceful moment was interrupted by the sound of rustling leaves. Henry turned just in time to see a fox dart from the edge of the trees, moving toward the pond with alarming speed. Panic surged through Henry as he jumped to his feet. Charlie! Pip! Charlie reacted instantly, letting out a loud warning quack. Pip froze for only a second before scrambling onto the shore, trying to keep up with Charlie as they both rushed toward Henry. But the fox was faster. It closed the distance in mere seconds, its sharp eyes locked onto Pip. Henry didn't think, he just moved. Grabbing the nearest object, a small metal bucket, he hurled it toward the fox with all his strength. The bucket clanged loudly against the ground, startling the fox enough for it to skid to a stop. Charlie flapped his wings aggressively, standing between Pip and the predator, making himself as large as possible. Pip cowered behind him, trembling. The fox hesitated, weighing its options. But when Henry took a step closer, shouting loudly, it finally turned and bolted back into the woods. Henry exhaled sharply, his heart hammering. Charlie quacked angrily, as if scolding the fox even though it was long gone. Pip, still shaken, pressed close to him. Henry crouched down. You okay, buddy? Charlie looked up at him, his feathers still puffed out from the adrenaline. Pip let out a small, nervous chirp. Henry gently stroked Pip's head, reassuring him. You're safe now. Daniel arrived a few minutes later, out of breath. What happened? Fox, Henry said simply. Daniel's eyes widened. You serious? Henry nodded. It almost got Pip. Charlie defended him. Daniel whistled low. Damn. Brave little guy. Charlie, still standing tall, gave a final quack before finally relaxing. Henry exhaled. We need to make sure this doesn't happen again. That night, Henry and Daniel worked on reinforcing the yard. They set up a low fence around the pond, adding wire mesh to keep predators out. It wasn't perfect, but it was better than nothing. Charlie and Pip stayed close, watching them with quiet curiosity. You know, Daniel mused as he hammered in the last section of the fence. I think Charlie knows he's protecting Pip. He's not just looking after him. He's fighting for him. Henry nodded. Yeah, I think so too. When they finished, Henry sat down on the porch, watching as the two ducks settled in for the night. Charlie tucked his head under his wing, but Pip stayed awake a little longer, watching the trees as if still wary of the fox. Henry sighed. "You're safe now, little one." And for the first time that night, Pip finally closed his eyes.